seminar. Today, we have the honor of having Kevin Lynch visiting from Northwestern University. And my name is Matt Mason. I'm just hosting the thing, so I'll introduce Kevin. Kevin Lynch got his bachelor's degree at Princeton University. And then following that, he came to Carnegie Mellon. He was among the very first students in the robotics Ph.D. program. And I met him then. It was my good luck to be his advisor. At least that was the formal job title while he did his Ph.D. And then he went on to Northwestern University, where he's currently a professor of mechanical engineering. He was the chair of the department for many years, the mechanical engineering department. He's the director of the Northwestern Center for Robotics and Biosystems. He's editor-in-chief of the IEEE Transactions on Robotics. He's written textbooks. He teaches several online courses through Coursera. And that's before we even start talking about his research accomplishments. So I don't know how he does all that. But in any case, it's a great honor to have you here, Kevin, and I'll turn it over to you now.
Great, thanks, Matt. It's a pleasure to be here virtually. I actually grew up in Pittsburgh, so I certainly look forward to the chances to visit there, but I will take the virtual visit this time. And I know that a lot of you are busy writing your ICRA or RAL papers right now, so thanks a lot for taking time out and spending some time with me. I did want to make sure that everybody knows that if you're ever writing that paper and it swells to 10 pages or 12 pages, but boy, it's really better at that length, then you should submit it to the Transactions in Robotics. And if your paper is accepted to the Transactions in Robotics, you'll be offered the chance to present it later at ICRA or IROS. So that's a chance to write the paper once instead of writing a conference version and then later a journal version. So please do send us your best work, and we'll help get you matched up with an ICRA or IROS at a later date. Okay, well, so yeah, pleasure to be here. My name is Kevin Lynch. This is going to be a talk giving a little bit of an overview of the Center for Robotics and Biosystems at Northwestern. This is a new center that was stood up last fall, consisting mostly of people like me who've been around for a while working in robotics. Got to get on there, right? There we go. This is us. So the center is it's a research space, but it's also a group of people. And the people that you see on this slide are the core faculty. So that means the faculty whose research labs are all adjacent to each other in our new facility. And so our faculty, and Ryan Truby is our latest hire, and he'll join us from MIT starting in the fall of next year. So the faculty in the Center for Robotics and Biosystems come from a variety of departments. My department is mechanical engineering, but a lot of what we do is at the intersection of robots and biological systems. Often that biological system is a human. So things like prosthetics and haptic interfaces and rehabilitation robotics. So we collaborate a lot with the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab, the Biomedical Engineering Department, Feinberg School of Medicine at Northwestern, Electrical and Computer Engineering, and Computer Science. And our faculty come from all of those departments. We also have a number of affiliated faculty, and you can see some of them represented here. I'm going to be looking, by the way, off to my left here because that's where my slides are. So apologies if you're seeing the side of my face a lot. So just a little history of any of you who've taken an introductory robotics course, and I guess that's most of you, have probably heard of Denevitt-Hartenberg parameters. When I showed up at Northwestern in '97 now, later that winter, Professor Dick Hartenberg passed away, and I had no idea he was a Northwestern person until they left his old books out for people to take home with them. And there I found Jacques Denevitt's PhD thesis introducing the DH parameters. So I've got that now in our little library. It came from about the mid-50s in his master's and PhD work. I'm a little sad I don't teach that anymore. Now I just teach screw theory for robot kinematics, but nonetheless, this is sort of the genesis of robotics at Northwestern. Okay, so research in the center, a lot of our work is on bio-inspired robotics and also neuromechanics and neuroscience. So we build robots that are inspired by biological systems, but we also use robots to help us study biological systems. And some of the faculty in our department, in our center, have PhDs in neuroscience or neurophysiology. So that's a lot of our work. And then the biological system that we work most closely with are humans. So there's a lot of work in our center in human machine systems. And these are collaborations with the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab, which used to be called the Rehab Institute of Chicago, and also our medical school. As I mentioned, haptics, prosthetics, robot rehabilitation, those are some areas that we collaborate in. Swarm robotics, I'm not going to talk about that today, but it is an area that I have a lot of interest in. We do a lot of work in control theory for multi-agent systems. And this last one is just sort of everything that doesn't fit those first three categories. So I'm going to just give you a brief flavor of some of the work that we do in collaboration with the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab, specifically in functional electrical stimulation for neuroprosthetics. So you know what a prosthetic is. It's typically a mechanical device or arm, and you attach it physically to your body and you control it either through mechanical means or some other electromechanical means. Well, a neuroprosthetic is for somebody who doesn't need the external structure of a prosthetic arm, but has lost the capability to control it due to perhaps a spinal cord injury. Oh, by the way, I don't think I mentioned this. Let me say this. If you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself and just shout it out. I don't think that there will be so many of them that it will be too disruptive, so feel free to do that. But if you can also just type it into the chat, and then Matt has offered to monitor them, monitor the questions. So for the neuroprosthetics, what we're looking for is a way to replace the lost connection from the motor cortex to the muscles that command the motion of the arm. So if you suffered a spinal cord injury, that connection has been lost. And so what we want to do is use a brain-machine interface to basically determine the user's intent, and then also find a way to straddle that lost connection by performing a surgery. So this is with our colleagues at Case Western Reserve University, where we implant a stimulator pack in the abdomen of the subject and use stimulators to stimulate the muscles or the nerves that go to the muscles of the shoulder and the back and the upper arm. So the idea is that the user thinks about something and their arm reaches out to accomplish the task. So this is the experimental setup. So this is a big group working on this project. Some people were focused on the brain-machine interface. That was not my piece of it. My piece of it was on the basically system ID from the muscle stimulations to the motions of the arm, and then how to use that for control. So the experimental system we have here, the subject will be seated and connected to a robot. The robot has a force torque sensor, and we can use that robot to drive the subject's arm around and measure forces so that we can get passive arm dynamics. And then at the same time, we can stimulate the muscles and then determine how the dynamics have changed due to the added component of forces at the joints. So we're trying to determine a model of how stimulations create forces and torques at the joints, and then what the arm dynamics are so that we can use that for control. So I'm going to skip the details, but like I mentioned, we're trying to learn this mapping from stimulations to muscle forces. And then we're also learning a semi-parametric representation of the arm dynamics, where we have a very simple model of the rigid body dynamics of an arm. And then we add to that basically Gaussian process models to correct for residual errors that are not captured by the model. So low degree of freedom model so that we get 60% of the way there to the dynamics and the Gaussian processes to correct that. So this is a video of an experiment. So right now the subject, she's had a high spinal cord injury due to a gunshot wound. And what we're doing here is we're basically driving her arm around while also stimulating the muscles so that we can determine what the passive arm dynamics are and what the muscle contributions are. And this is just one particular trajectory that you're seeing here. After doing this, after moving the arm around in a variety of ways and stimulating the muscles, then we can build a model and we can invert that model for control. So now what's happening is we have into this inverse model, we are commanding how we want the arm to move, and it's spitting back to us the stimulations that we should be applying to the muscles to cause that motion. What's happening right here is the robot arm is in free mode, so it's not assisting in any way. It's just trying to apply zero forces. And then if we disconnect the robot arm completely, this is the motion of her arm in response to the stimulations from the model that we've built. Okay. So this is still very crude, and there are some issues with the system. In particular, the servo update rate is only 13 hertz. So 13 times a second, we're able to sense where her arm is and then apply a new stimulation to the muscles. And that was partly chosen due to maximizing the muscle forces that we can get, and also to prevent pain, because even though she is unable to actuate her arm, she is still able to feel some pain. So all of these things create challenges, and this is still an early result, but you can see that the model that we've learned allows her to move her arm from stretched out to close to her face for perhaps a feeding action. Okay, so I just mentioned that as one example of our collaboration with the Shirley Ryan Ability Lab, but most of my talk today is going to be talking about robot locomotion and manipulation. So this is joint work with Dan Lynch and Paul Umbenhauer, and Dan is no relation. He's our PhD student. And here's an example of locomotion on yielding ground. So this is a rodent being chased, and you can see here as it's escaping, when it pushes on the ground, the ground gives way. So the thing that we're interested in is how can you do efficient locomotion over yielding surfaces? So here the elephant shrew is just trying to escape, so it's not worried about energy efficiency. But if you think about long-term locomotion over sandy surfaces, or if you think about yourself walking on the beach, if you walk down near the water where the sand is packed tight, it's much easier to walk. If you get into the loose sand, then you're using a lot more energy. So the question of locomoting on yielding ground led us to this problem formulation that we called the soft landing problem. If you deform the ground, you're not going to get that energy back. Any of the work that you lose to pressing the ground down is not going to spring you back and be returned to you. So if you want to do efficient locomotion over soft ground, you might want to minimize the deformation that you're creating. So even simpler version of that is, what if you're falling into the ground? How do you control your muscles, or how do you control the robot so that your penetration into the ground is as little as possible? So we call that the soft landing problem. So here's the very simplest test bed that we could think of to start to get at some of the fundamental questions of how to land on soft ground without wasting energy. So imagine now that you have a body that's just a mass, a foot that's a mass, and they're connected to each other by an actuator. And then they're impacting the ground, and the ground we're going to model as a one-way spring. So basically, the deeper you press into the ground, the more force it resists you with. But once you start to lift up from the ground does not spring back. So you're basically losing all the energy it takes to compress the spring and never getting it back. This is a fairly simple model of soft ground deformation, but has been shown to represent first order effects for many typical sorts of soft grounds. So here's a picture of the experimental setup. The body is just the stator of a linear actuator, and then the linear actuator is pounding the foot into the ground. And then we mount it all on a guide rail so that we keep the motion one-dimensional. And then there's a lift mechanism so we can lift up the robot and drop it. And this is just a video of that robot hopping. Okay, so the video that you're seeing here, you can see it's already dug itself a hole. The ground has become fairly compressed, become more like rigid ground. We're more interested in what happens when the ground is still soft. Okay, and we also want to be able to control the stiffness of the ground. So for that, we have this air blower system, and let me show you here. So here the poppy seeds that are making our virtual sand are being blown from below by a fan that is blowing through a diffuser, and it creates this uplift on the sand so that it settles back very loosely. And when the sand is packed very loosely, the stiffness of the ground is half of what it will be compared to what you saw in the previous video when it gets pounded down. So we can control the stiffness of the ground to about a factor of 2. Okay, so simple dynamics for this robot. We're going to find a unit force, which is just the total mass times the gravitational constant, a unit time, and a unit distance. And once we've defined these constants, the equations of motion become very simple. Right? So we have the dynamics of the body of the robot and the dynamics of the foot of the robot. U is the control force that's being applied. And the units of U are basically M times G. So in these simplified dynamics, they only depend on the mass ratio between the body and the foot. The controls that we apply are bounded by the force limits that the actuator can apply and also the stroke limit, right? So it matters a lot how much stroke you can get out of the linear actuator when you're trying to land softly. And for us, the gait of the robot is only defined by how fast it's coming down when it hits, since it's just a one-dimensional hopper. Okay, so the problem we want to solve is how do we minimize the penetration depth subject to control and stroke bounds on the foot? And the answer, if you've ever taken an optimal controls course and learned about Pontryagin's maximum principle, it's an application of that plus a little bit more work. And it tells us the optimal thing to do if you want your foot to penetrate as little as possible is as soon as you touch the ground with your foot, you stomp down on it, you compress the ground as much as possible, but for a very short period of time. And that's what's happening right here. Then you lift up on the foot so that you stop its motion downwards. And then you apply a downwards force over this long period that's just the force that you need to keep the body at a stationary height above the foot. So that's it. That's the optimal thing to do if you want to minimize your penetration. Stomp into the ground to the right depth and then just sit there while you slow down the mass of the body. Okay, so here's what you can do. So if the mass ratio is 5, so the body is 5 times as massive as the foot, and that corresponds to our experimental setup. And these are your stroke limits and maximum force limits. Here's what happens if you drop a rigid body. So this is the body's attached to the foot by a rigid bar. Here's the depth you'll sink to depending on the impact velocity. So the faster you impact, the deeper you sink. 1 here is just the force that you need to prevent the body from falling, or to prevent the whole body plus foot from falling into the sand. And if you use this optimal force control, it shows that you can achieve a much lesser depth of penetration than you do by treating the leg as a rigid body. Not a surprise that you can decrease it. This is just a quantification of that. So if your downward velocity at impact is 5, if you use optimal force control, your depth of penetration is about 2, but if you were a rigid body, your depth would be 6. Okay. All right, so good thing is we found the optimal solution. The bad thing is that if you try to use this kind of bang bang optimal control, first of all, your control is discontinuous. You're changing the forces instantaneously. And secondly, this behavior is sensitive to initial conditions. So if you're not coming down at 5 units of velocity, but 6 units of velocity, then this kind of solution might give you bad response, bad behavior. So instead we asked, could we use impedance control to minimize our depth of penetration? The nice thing about that is there's a lot of evidence for impedance control from biology. You can implement it robustly as opposed to kind of fragile optimal force control. But the drawback is it's not optimal. So the question we asked is how not optimal is impedance control? And the answer is almost as good, right? So if you take the stroke limits and the ground stiffness and you search over the space of possible impedance laws for the best possible solution, then you find out the best possible impedance law gives you a response that's almost as good as force control. So here's our impedant hopper versus our optimal force control hopper, and they penetrate almost the same amount. So this is just a video of some experiments. So here's a robot that is falling. It's got a very stiff connection between the foot and the body. And you can see that it penetrates fairly deeply into the ground. Whereas if we tune the impedance, so tune towards the stiffness of the ground, then we can achieve a much lesser impact into the soft surface. These are just some experiments. So the simulation based on our first order spring model for ground results are shown here in the lines, and then the data, 5 points averaged at each data point are shown also. So here we're setting the stiffness of the spring, and we're varying the damping of the impedance law over a range. And what you notice for all of them is that there is a minimum in the damping. There's a minimum of the penetration depth. So here at a high impact velocity, we want a not very dampy impedance gain, whereas at a lower impact velocity, we want an impedance gain that's a little bit higher, or a damping gain that's a little bit higher to achieve minimum impact depth. Okay, so what are the takeaways from this? Basically, to minimize penetration, you want to have long legs. So, when a cat is dropped on the ground, it's going to extend its legs out as much as possible and use a large stroke to absorb its initial energy. Same thing here. If we want to have a soft landing, we want to have a long leg so we can have a large stroke to absorb the energy. And we want to have a light foot. So those two things together will allow us to minimize our penetration. Optimal impedance depends on the ground stiffness, the mass ratio, the stroke limit, and impact velocity. So if you're running on ground with changing stiffness properties, it's a good idea to continually sense those stiffness properties so that you can update your impedance gains. And finally, optimal impedance control can perform nearly as well as true optimal control. Next steps for this, we've got a multi-degree of freedom quasi-direct drive hopper that we're going to be using for locomotion in the sandy testbed that I showed you earlier. So this initial experiments are about understanding how to do good impedance control and interacting with soft surfaces. Okay, and then I want to finish by talking about two different projects in manipulation. So ever since I worked with Matt many years ago, I've been working on graspless or non-prehensile manipulation. So how do you manipulate objects without having a firm grasp on it? So the video you see on the left is one example of that. So this is a plate vibrating at 30 frames per second. And depending on how you control the 6 degree of freedom vibration of the plate, you can create different effective force fields on the surface of the plate to drive the parts around. On the right here is more recent work on graspless manipulation that we've been doing. And so that's the second part of the manipulation portion of the talk I'll talk about. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about non-prehensile manipulation, and in particular, contact juggling. So again, this is something that I learned from Matt many years ago. Contact juggling is best explained by demonstration, and I can't do it, so I'm going to show you a video. here's a guy in Taipei showing us how he can manipulate these crystal balls, mostly without ever grasping them. Okay, so that's why we call it non-prehensile. How to control the motion of an object without achieving a form or force control or force closure grasp of the object. So people say to me, okay, well, why would you want a robot to do this? This is a pretty specific example. Well, I think of this as a challenge problem. When you see this kind of capability, how do we arrange the dynamics and the contacts to be able to control motions of ungrasped objects so dexterously? So here are some examples from the robotics community. So maybe down here on the left is the only three-dimensional example you see up here. So this is some work out of Naples. And they're showing us how they can control the position and orientation of a ball on a plate by carefully rolling it along a pre-planned path. You know, the idea is, how do I get it to the right position and orientation relative to the plate? And up here you can see some planar examples where we're controlling the motion of one disc rolling on top of another disc. Here's a ball rolling continuously around a shape. And then here's a high-ally-like example throwing where the shape of the manipulator and its motion were co-designed to achieve the kind of throwing motion that you see here. So here's the question that we wanted to address with our work on contact juggling, is if you're given one smooth spatial object and another smooth spatial object, and they're going to roll relative to each other, how do you control the motion of the supporting one to create the desired motion of the object that you're trying to control? And this is the work of Zach Woodruff, who just graduated a couple of months ago. So I'm not going to get into the differential geometry of contact. You know, obviously we have some parameterization of the surfaces in contact, and we need to deal with the kinematics. I'll just say that, you know, to solve the problem of controlling the rolling motion of one object relative to another when they're arbitrary smooth surfaces, we need to have the first and second order kinematics. How do objects roll on top of each other? Well, the first order kinematics have been around for a long time, since the late 80s. I would credit to the work of David Montana with Roger Brockett at Harvard, although others have worked on it too. And then the second order kinematics have been around not quite as long, since the mid 90s or so. And what I mean by second order kinematics is if you specify the rolling accelerations, how do the two objects move relative to each other? But early on in our work on contact juggling, we discovered that the kinematics as published were actually wrong. So one of Zach's contributions was to correct the second order kinematics of rolling. And then beyond that, we have to think about dynamics, motion planning, and feedback stabilization. And what we found when we started our work on this was that the dynamics, motion planning, and feedback stabilization had been expressed or solved, but only for specific cases, like a ball rolling on a plane or two spheres rolling on top of each other. So part of Zach's contribution was to formulate the dynamics and the motion planning and the feedback stabilization problem for general smooth surfaces. So let me give you one example. So here is a spinning plate rotating at a constant velocity, and then a ball sitting on top of it. And what's really interesting about this is that there is a stable solution for the dynamics of, or for the motion of the ball, where the contact point is just moving around in a circle at a continuous rate. So let me show that again. So as the plate rotates, the ball stays in a constant circle. It never rolls off to the side, never leaves the plate. Stays in this constant steady state motion. So part of Zach's work was to derive the second order dynamics, and what he was able to show is that his dynamics, you know, which find the acceleration of the ball given the motion of the plate, exactly or almost exactly, you know, predict the analytical solution to the motion of the ball. So the analytical solution are these dots here, yellow dots in the blue, is what you get from running his simulation for several turns of the plate. Whereas if you try to use another simulator like what you might get from Bullet, the ball will eventually wander off the plate due to accumulation of error. So just for the dynamics, one of Zach's contribution was to write them exactly for the instantaneous case for second order systems. The next problem was doing motion planning and control. And I won't say a lot about it, except that Zach spent a fair amount of time figuring out how to use nonlinear optimization so that when you apply it to these rolling problems, contact juggling problems, that they will reliably find solutions. So any of you who've used nonlinear optimization before know that you can get stuck in local minima in the solution space. So Zach figured out a way to use iterative refinement, where basically you're continually refining the trajectory of the hand so that over time you better and better satisfy the dynamics. And with that method, he's able to usually find solutions to contact juggling problems. And then for feedback control, there's not a lot new there, just a linear quadratic regulator with time varying gains to stabilize the trajectory. So let me just show you one example of motion planning. So the problem here is to reorient this ball, get it back to the same contact point on the plate, but achieve a different orientation of the frame of the ball, which you can see here. So there is an analytical solution to this problem. This was done in the work by Ruggiero and Siciliano, where basically if they roll the ball along this path, they're able to exactly achieve the reorientation. What Zach asked is, can we do that more efficiently? And so what he was able to show is that his motion planning method automatically comes up with a solution like the one you see here. Now that's without control, though. That's just an open loop motion plan. So here's Zach trying to apply that now to a two-dimensional problem where he wants to flip up this ellipse from its stable equilibrium to an unstable equilibrium. And you know, because of modeling errors and control errors, you know, obviously it doesn't just come to a stop at the unstable equilibrium. So now you apply feedback control to try to correct for modeling and control errors. And this is kind of a first simple example. Here you can see what the ellipse will do if you don't apply any control. And now the problem is to damp out any rolling motion. So here there's a vision system that's looking at these markers on the ellipse. And as he disturbs the ellipse, the hand is just moving to prevent rolling between the two of them. Okay, so that was kind of a first experiment to see that we could do feedback control to stabilize, in this case, a particular equilibrium. And then he applied it to his to make that flip up problem a closed loop problem. So here, basically, he's rolling up the ellipse, and then when it gets close to the equilibrium, the unstable equilibrium, he turns on a second controller. The first controller is just tracking the trajectory, and the second controller is just stabilizing the unstable equilibrium. This is the same thing, performed 12 times, and you can see that the behavior is quite consistent. And this is just a plot of the results. If you just do the open loop control, the behavior is not too different from the closed loop control for a while, but then here you start to see divergence. Without the closed loop control, you basically run away and roll off the edge of the manipulator. With the closed loop control, it keeps it much closer to the desired trajectory. And then right here is where the balance controller is flipped on. And so you can see the balance controller actually has much higher gains than the trajectory tracking controller. And that's why you see this kind of overshoot and settling. Just another example of using the motion planning and control. So here the plan was to take the ellipse to a state whereby its free flight motion would cause it to bounce on the manipulator at the catch position and then stabilize it at the upright configuration. I'll show it one more time. Okay, so that's the contact juggling story. So Zach, did the three-dimensional kinematics, dynamics, motion planning, and control, and then his experiments were all in 2 dimensions, like you saw there. I want to move on to our recent work in grasping manipulation. And any of you who've ever used chopsticks before have probably picked them up where the ends of the chopsticks are misaligned, and you might use a plate or something else, push them against the plate, get them in alignment, and now they're much more convenient for use. So here's a picture of that. So what do? You move your hands, you put the chopsticks against some contact constraint, move your hand, and the contact constraints help you perform the alignment. So we call this in-hand sliding regrasp. The problem here is to use external constraints to help you achieve a regrasp of an object by sliding at the contacts. And to model this, we are going to treat the contacts as essentially contact points that are mounted to a position-controlled finger anchor by a multidimensional spring. Okay, so what you see here is the fingertip at its nominal configuration if no forces were applied to it. Here it is at a displaced configuration due to forces, and the force that it's applying to the object that it's grasping lives somewhere inside this friction cone due to the Coulomb friction assumption. Okay, so we call this spring sliding compliance because the spring compliance is what we're used to. You apply force and the spring complies, and this is important for when you're doing sliding grasping over smooth objects, that you have some kind of spring-like behavior to maintain the contact. And we call it sliding compliance because there's a non-linear relationship now between the sliding motion of the finger and the forces that it applies to the object. So one is kind of a non-linear velocity compliance, the other is a spring. So here's an example. So this is an Allegro robot hand, and what we're going to try to do in this example is we're going to try to move the fingers from this location to a different grasp location where the fingers are down here. And we're going to do that by moving these position-controlled finger anchors, which are compliantly connected to the fingertips. And while we do that, we want to ensure quasi-static balance of the object so it doesn't fall over. Okay, so to do this, we ask the question, okay, for any set of grasp contacts on any smooth 3D object, we need to know the forward mechanics, which is if as I move the finger anchors, how do the fingertips move over the object? The inverse mechanics, which says that if I want the fingertips to slide in a certain way, how do I move the finger anchors? And then finally, to use that information to plan a regrasp to accomplish the kind of task like you see here. So I'm not going to talk a lot about the detailed mechanics. I just want to give this picture here because it kind of explains the main ideas. So imagine that you've got a fingertip in contact with a flat surface, and I'm drawing this, essentially this friction cone. So if I assume that the stiffness that's connecting this anchor to the fingertip is the identity matrix scaled by something, then I can just take the friction cone as it would be drawn here and raise it up. And this tells me that if the anchor is anywhere inside the cone, then the fingertip is going to stick to the surface. If I lift the anchor above the cone, then the fingertip is going to lift off. And if I move the fingertip over to the edge of the cone, then the fingertip is going to slide. Okay. So in this case, the inverse mechanics problem we want to solve is, okay, if I want the fingertip to move to the left how should I move the finger anchor? Well, first of all, it has to be on the edge of the cone. Otherwise, we have to first get it to the edge of the cone. And then once it's at the edge of the cone, we have a choice of how to move it. So there's a general solution that tells us, okay, if we move in this direction, you know, we can slide the fingertip as specified here. But I can also add a component to the finger anchor motion that lives in this null space, where it doesn't affect the motion of the fingertip, but it does affect the contact force. Okay, so that just gives us extra freedoms in how we design a regrasp. So now we have the mechanics that describe how fingers slide over the object and leaving out all the details. Those become constraints to the motion planning problem. The motion planning problem is, how do you move the anchors of the fingers so that the fingertips slide where you want them to go, all the while maintaining a quasi-static balance. And I'm going to skip the methods for solving that for this specific example. The solution method depends on, you know, the exact solution method you use depends on the kind of hand you have or the task. It's the constraints that are the real contribution of this work. You know, these are the constraints you need to satisfy. But let me show you for this example the solution. First, the finger anchors are going to move so that the forces currently being applied by the fingertips are on the edges of the friction cone. And then the fingers will begin sliding downwards in response to the motion of these anchors. So you can see the virtual anchors of the fingers are here. So here the forces are moving to the edge of the friction cone. And now, as we slide these anchors down, the fingertips slide, you can see the predicted forces indicated in blue here. And those are being balanced by the gravity forces and the forces due to the contacts at the bottom. Okay, so this is a very simple example of a regrasp made possible by our understanding of spring sliding compliance. But to do this, we needed to implement compliance control on the fingertips of our Allegro robot hand. So it's a nice robot hand. It's got, you know, 4 fingers and lots of degrees of freedom, but they're very highly geared joints. And doing something like force control or compliance control is not easy when you have these kind of stiff joints with a lot of friction in the transmissions. So what we wanted to be able to do this kind of manipulation more naturally is we'd like to have fingertips where we know what the compliance is, that we don't have to rely on sort of poor compliance control behaviors from the robot hand. Contact point detection, we'd like to know where the contacts are happening on the fingertips. We'd like to be able to measure the wrenches or the forces, but more generally the wrenches being applied through the fingertips. And we'd like these fingertips to be low cost. So the fingertips we're using here are just 3D printed cones. What we'd like to do is put tactile sensors on there so that we can control this kind of manipulation more naturally. We do have SynTouch tactile sensors, very expensive, more than $5,000 for each when we bought them. And they actually don't work very well for either contact location or wrench measurement, which are 2 things that we want. So that led us to design a new tactile sensor. And this is work that we're just writing up now, also for ICRA, like many of you are. We wanted the tactile sensor to give us reliable compliance so that if we mounted it on a stiff finger, we'd still get good compliance, reliable compliance out of it. We wanted to be able to detect the contact location. We want to be able to detect the wrench being transmitted, and we wanted low cost. And this is work with my students, Tito and Juan, and Paul Umbenhauer, my collaborator. So this is the design of our tactile sensor. Basically, it's got 3 parts. It's got a base, and in that base is a camera. It's got a fingertip, and between the 2 is a flexure. And in the picture over here, the flexure is just a simple compression spring. The subtitle for this sensor, which is called the Visiflex, is yet another optical tactile sensor. And there's quite a few out there, and we'll talk about them in a minute. But let me just explain how that works generally. You got a camera looking up from below. You've got an acrylic dome here with light being infused inside of it. The light is totally internally reflected unless there's contact at the cap, in which case there's light scattered back towards the camera. We pick it up as a contact location. And this LED board also has downward facing fiducials, and we track those to detect the displacement of the dome. The camera down here is operating at 60 Hertz and 1600 by 1200 resolution. And that's an image of the current prototype. So there's a lot of optical tactile fingertips. And the first one I used was way back in 1992, a waveguide sensor that also used frustrated total internal reflection for determining the contact location on a fingertip. And then there's also this work that created the OptoForce force sensor, where LEDs and photodiodes were used to detect basically how much force is being applied to a fingertip by pushing on it. So basically the deflection of the LED light created a signal in the photodiodes, and you interpret that as a force. Other optical tactile sensors include finger vision there at Carnegie Mellon, gel sight from MIT, lots of follow-up work to that, and the tactip. All of these have different capabilities. The thing that ours was designed for is to give us the wrench. None of these are very good at providing a 6 degree of freedom wrench. To give us the contact location, and also to provide compliance, reliable compliance for reliable manipulation. So I would say that our work is probably most closely inspired by these two pieces of work. So just to give you an idea how it works, here's the view of the camera from the bottom. Here's a reconstruction over there. As we displace the dome, we're tracking these fiducials, and that motion of the dome that you see reconstructed over here, along with the known stiffness of the flexure, allows us to determine the wrench that's being applied. We get the 6 degree of freedom displacement of the dome by tracking these 8 fiducials. This is showing contact location sensing. So, you know, pushing on it here, you get a bright spot appearing in the camera over there that gets turned into a reconstruction of the contact location over there. Flexure design is something that we spend a lot of time on, but for the purposes of this talk, we're going to treat it just as a simple compression spring. And I'm going to skip through all of this. But basically, we've designed our flexure for the first prototype of this sensor to give us about 10 newtons of force at about 2.5 millimeters of displacement in the Z direction of the sensor. And the reason for that is that our Allegro hand is capable of producing about 10 newtons of force at the fingertips, and 2.5 millimeters of displacement is a reasonable displacement for a fingertip the size of ours. So to test the sensor, we mounted in this very precise 5 degree of freedom motion stage. Can deflect with a repeatability of less than a micron and less than 0.001 degrees. So this testing stage is moving the dome around. It's telling us what the actual displacement of the dome is. The vision system is reporting what it thinks the displacement of the dome is, and now we can compare how much error there is in the vision and also how much there is in the wrench sensing due to the force torque sensor we have. And then for contact location sensing, we're basically putting a rigid cap over the dome and then pushing on it. And we know where the contacts are in the dome, or the holes are in the dome, so we know where the contacts should be. So these experimental results basically showing us that the contact locations we pick up with the camera are pretty close to the actual locations, less than a millimeter of location error, and the repeatability is very high, 0.1 millimeters. And then this is a different test where we applied contacts on a line over the dome and showed that all the contacts do lie along lines with very high R squared. And then for wrench sensing, basically our resulting wrench error. So we're comparing what the Visiflex tells us we think the force should be compared to what the ATI Nano 17 is telling us. And we get a typical wrench sensing error of about 0.1 newtons over a range of 10 newtons, so about 1 part in 100. And then 15 Newton millimeters for torque. So that is the Visiflex. The next thing we're going to do with it is actually do some in-hand manipulation. As of right now, the sensor is just being completed and tested in the lab. So that kind of closes my talk. These are the things that I talked about, and these are the people who did the work. Thanks to Dan for his work on the hopping robot, Zach for the contact juggling, John and Juan for their work on in-hand regrasping, Tito and Juan for their work on the tactile sensor, and many people for the work on the functional electrical stimulation neuroprosthetic. So I'd be happy to take any questions. Thanks for your attention.
Fantastic, Kevin. Let's see, we do have some questions. I see some people applauding. I'll applaud too. My video back. There it is. Thanks, Kevin. That was good stuff. Howie has some questions, so I guess I'll hand off to Howie first.
Yeah, so Kevin, thank you for the nice talk, and I apologize. I'm gonna have to go away in a couple of minutes because I have to go back for money on a Friday afternoon. But I did send you an email with the questions as well, but I'll just run through them really quickly. One is the book that you found, is it possible if you can scan it in so everyone can have a copy of it? I don't think the copyright laws will apply anymore.
The what book?
The Hartenberg.
Oh, yeah. I can scan pieces of it if you want. You're welcome to it.
Well, I think it would be a cool thing to have.
I'll put it online somewhere.
Yeah, Matt once gave me a copy of a Hartenberg and Denevit book, which was cool to have. And I loaned it to a student, and then I never saw that book again.
Yeah, the coolest part of it was, it's got his handwritten notes on some of the pages. So.
Oh, that's wonderful. So I guess I'll ask one question real fast, and that is, so in the beginning, I'm really interested in the granular surface locomotion work that you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if you know of any evidence of where instead of one rat or one animal running away on the granular surface, if there was like a swarm that was running away and they had some non-obvious benefit other than as long.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, I think there's evidence of animals putting their feet in the footprints of the front feet, so back feet going into the front feet holes. Right. And you can see why that might have some benefit since it's already pre-compressed the ground there. But yeah, I'm not familiar. I mean, I guess it would make sense if they stood in a line, walked along in a line and took advantage of that strategy with each other. But I am not aware of any evidence. So
do you know the famous scallop theorem, where you have this two-link system? It opens, it closes, and it doesn't go anywhere.
Yeah.
In a fluid. Yeah. So there's this one work, and I really wish I remember the name of the authors, where if you have a swarm of scallops, because they interfere with each other, then the scallops can move collectively. And I was wondering if there was a comparable result where one guy's pressing in the dirt that helps the other guy press in the dirt, and so forth.
Yeah.
In the agents.
Yeah. Good question. I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, my intention wasn't to stump you today, but thanks for thinking about it.
And thanks for reminding me what the scallop theorem was, because if you left it there, I wouldn't have known. But
yeah, no problem.
Once you clarify.
So I apologize. I'm going to release the floor so others can ask questions, and then I'll have to go away in 5 minutes anyway.
Okay, good to see you, Howie.
Likewise.
Let's see, I see a question from Rodrigo Ventura. Rodrigo?
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, great talk. I enjoyed very much. I was wondering whether there is any application of your research in space robotics domain?
Any application. Boy, I have to say yes to that. Well, I mean, I guess we have NASA written here, so I don't know if you call it extraterrestrial locomotion, but they funded some of the work on the locomotion in granular media. So that's one obvious place. Were you thinking of something else?
No, I just was curious because of you have the NASA logo over there. But yeah, thanks for your answer. So
Yeah, I mean, so the locomotion on yielding ground is an obvious one,
yeah.
but obviously anything with dynamics, you know, in space, you know, things are not bound by gravity, so you can do dynamic things a lot slower in space. So there's an opportunity for any kind of dynamic manipulation to be useful in space. Speaking of which, I should also mention that I talked to Ankit Bhatia earlier today, and he was showing his really cool direct drive fingertips. And part of the motivation behind this tactile sensor here, by the way, is only good for quasi-static problems, right? The camera itself is at 60 hertz, but there's also a soft flexure in there, so you're talking about a few hertz maximum sorts of problems that you can use it for. This was designed in part thinking about the Allegro hand and some other robot hands out there that are designed to have highly geared joints. But if you can do implicit or inherent or intrinsic, contact sensing, force sensing, then this kind of design might be obviated. And so that's something that's exciting about the direct drive fingers that Ankit showed me earlier today.
Yeah. And also one interesting application is for asteroid robotics for asteroid exploration. Because of the low gravity, the hopping is much more efficient than having wheels.
Yep. Yeah, good point. Thank you.
Thanks. Very nice.
Thanks. I see a question from David Neiman.
Hi. Yeah. So when you were talking about the energy efficient locomotion on deformable ground, the big source of energy loss you were considering was pressing into the ground and the ground not springing back.
Right.
What about energy loss from like that shrew running away and kicking up dirt behind it as it's running away? For instance, maybe you want to be taking big steps because you'd sink into the ground at each step, but big steps requires, more friction force pushing you forward each step.
Uh-huh. Yeah, so first of all, again, the shrew was running away, so energy conservation was not its concern there. And we were in the experiments I showed here, we're only in 1 degree of freedom, right? So there's no kicking up sand. But our more recent work has been on using granular simulations as well as simple resistive force theory to think about what kinds of losses are present when you're doing sort of more 3D motion through sand, right? So if you're running, if you actually have a forward motion now you have to think about effectively kicking up sand or at least pushing it backwards and the losses that are there too. So those are actually directions we're working towards now, but are not represented in this work.
Okay. Cool.
Hey, Kevin, something that I wonder about is if you were going to build wheels for soft ground or tracks, could you somehow take the principles, I'll call them, that you've discovered here and find a way of applying it to something that's more like a track, I'll say? Some weird mechanism where the slats of the track are slapping the ground instead of.
Yeah, it's a good question. Not something I've thought about, but good question. Yeah, I don't think I have anything intelligent to say about that, but it seems like a fun thing to think about.
Hey, go ahead and say something stupid. That would be fun.
I've probably already done that several times. So.
I see a question from Arca.
Hi, Professor. I was wondering if there is any published work on the tactile sensor you just described.
Not yet. Just like many of you, my students are busy writing it right now. So hopefully, if all goes well, it'll be submitted next week. And then I'm sure we'll put it up on archive. But thanks for asking. Hopefully soon.
Thank you so much.
Well, I guess we'll call it a day. And thanks, everybody. And especially thanks, Kevin. One more time to express our thanks. I'm sorry we're not all together, so you'll get the full, rush of accepting our enthusiastic love for the work that you've done.
Thank
Next
you.
time.
Thank you for having me. Yes, next time.
So long, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you for coming.